Again, thank you all this afternoon for joining us. I'm Bridget Warner. I'm the site manager here at the Zwaanendael Museum. I will be turning it over directly to Verdi Lee, who's our curator of education for historical and cultural affairs. And she will be doing all the introductions and giving you a little more background information before we get started. But in the meantime, I just want to welcome everybody. Looks like it's 4:05, so I think we've probably given enough time for everybody to log in. If we have some latecomers joining us, that'll be fine too. So I'm going to turn it over to Verdi Lee. Thank you all again.
So I am going to be sharing my screen. So if Bridget or Devin will let me know if you see it. I always like to have a screen check before we start and get too far into things. So can you see my screen? All right, excellent, very good. So what I'd like to do is to first welcome everyone to Delaware's First Communities. And this afternoon, we will be discussing Native American history and culture, both past and present. So welcome to the webinar. To begin, my name is Verdi Lee, and I am the Curator of Education for the Delaware Division of Historical and Cultural Affairs. I'm honored to be joined today with my colleagues and friends, Theo Braunskill, who is the Treasurer and Elder Council Member with the Lenape Indian Tribe of Delaware, and Nena Todd, who is the Historic Site Supervisor for the Delaware Division of Historical and Cultural Affairs at the Old State House. And also a huge thank you to Zwaanendael Museum for hosting this webinar. So just to begin who we are, both Nena, myself, Bridget, and Devin, so all of us work for the Delaware Division of Historical and Cultural Affairs. We call it HCA. You know, I always like to start these webinars talking a little bit about HCA because we are not well known. And personally, we want to change that. So HCA is a state agency which is housed under the Delaware Department of State. Now, our division is very small with about 80 to 90 employees, but that doesn't change our mission. So what do? We do all things history. We talk about it, we preserve it, we collect it, we protect it, and we want to make sure that we can share it. So what does that look like? Well, things like our division houses the state's collection, which includes more than 50,000 objects. This collection includes our material culture, art, ephemera, and furniture. But we also house the state's archaeological collections, and that numbers more than 4 million artifacts that document Native American cultures prior to European contact, as well as post-contact societies. So within HCA is the State Historic Preservation Office, which manages Delaware's Historic Preservation Tax Credit Program. Now, that program assists in preserving and rehabilitating historic buildings. Also, the Historic Preservation Office ministers the National Register of Historic Places program. Now, within SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, are historic preservationists, archaeologists, and historians. So HCA also manages about 43 historic properties. We partner with other agencies that utilize those sites, such as Delaware Nature Society at Abbott's Mill in Milford, the Friends of Belmont Hall in Smyrna, or the Delaware Breakwater East End Lighthouse in the Delaware Bay. Personally, that's one of my favorite properties right there. So the division manages and operates 6 museums across the 3 counties of Delaware. In those museums, we offer guided tours, field trip opportunities, educational programming, and special events. And those include our hosts, starting here in Sussex County, the Zwaanendael Museum in downtown Lewis, the John Dickinson Plantation, located south of Dover, the Johnson Victrola Museum, which is located in downtown Dover, the Old State House, which is located on the Green in Dover. Then if we move to Newcastle, we have the Newcastle Courthouse Museum located in Old Newcastle. And our 6th museum is not quite open fully to the public yet. Couch's Bridge was the residence of the Couch family from 1740s to 2016. It had 9 different generations of owners, and the site includes the homestead, Couch's Bridge Battlefield, the site of Delaware's only American Revolutionary battle, and the Couch Diet Mill Complex. Now, as we get into our webinar, because history is our passion, we should be mindful of the way we share history. Now, as a cultural institution, we have to be aware of our own role and how in the past we may have participated in promoting the majority history, which can look very white and very male. So we look to ourselves as an institution and we say, how can we do better? And how do we change? Now, things have been changing within our division over the years, but I will say at least for the past 2 years, we have been much more active and intentional with those changes. And one way that we've done this is with our race and equity statement. Now, 2 statements helped guide the creation of this webinar, that we strive to practice inclusive history, and we will be undeterred in bringing forth diversity in our stories. Now, in addition, we want all voices to be heard. I think like many organizations, we struggle with how to tell Delaware's more troubling history. Now, we are stewards of Delaware's history, and this history includes stories of pain, courage, and defeat. So we cannot shrink from the pain of our shared history. So before we begin, we must become comfortable with discussing this type of difficult and hard history. Now, mainstream historical narratives have been the default, while narratives of historically oppressed people and communities are optional learning. Now, this can no longer be the case or the status quo. For history to be inclusive and diverse, all history must be recognized as our history. We cannot let our comfort level determine what we hear or what we do not hear, because to be honest, that is what privilege looks like. So what we discussed tonight might make you angry, it can make you sad, it might make you feel guilty. Now, I ask you to listen, because if we want to generate change, we have to listen and be uncomfortable. So what are the benefits for engaging in these discussions where we are uncomfortable? Well, we create a place where everyone can share and take ownership of our history. We increase the stories represented. People begin to see themselves as an integral part of our history. We can see how our decisions in the past have led us directly to where we are today, how those choices have formed the institutions and the societal framework in which we operate in the 21st century. So we begin to see also the context that historical analysis helps bring. And in the end, we hope that this work will help us make deeper connections to the communities that we serve. So before we begin, we have a few things to discuss for perspective. Why would a population of people disappear from the historic record? Why would they disappear from our state? Did they in fact remain? So was this a systematic and coordinated effort to cause their disappearance or erase them from the historic landscape? So to diminish a culture, you begin to erase them from the record. You underestimate their population, you reclassify who they are. Census takers or government officials have no knowledge of their existence and begin to call Native Americans by other names. And if you look to the census records and other period documents from that time, you can start to look for code words to see how people might have been reclassified. Now, in the 18th and 19th century, those words might be things like French Canadians, free people of color, mulatto, colored people, Moors, or Negroes. So there may be forced assimilation. If you see assimilation efforts, there is a population of people you are trying to assimilate into the larger culture. And that includes ways of stripping away languages, making ceremonies illegal, and restricting the movement of people. Now tonight, Theo and Nena will discuss the archaeological record of Native Americans in Delaware, the history and current goals of one of the state's recognized tribe, the Lenape Indian tribe of Delaware. So on that note, I would like the opportunity for my colleagues to be able to introduce themselves, and we will begin with Theo.
Hello, and thank you for being with us this afternoon. My name is Theo Braunskill. I am a descendant of the first people of the first state. I was born and raised here in Dover. After I married in 1970, I moved to New York. I've been married for over 50 years, and we have 7 children. I've served my community for many years. I worked as a secretary to the vice principal in a high school for 10 years. I worked as a regional director of Suffolk County under Mrs. Matilda Cuomo for 8 years in the New York State mentoring program. I then moved on to become the Affirmative Action Officer and Diversity Coordinator for the town of Southampton. I retired from there in 2005. I moved back to Dover and immediately became involved with my native tribe. After 2 years, I was elected to serve as councilwoman. I helped institute the tribe's drum group, youth group, and elders council. I was on the Lenape Indian Tribe's Public Outreach Committee. I worked with tribal members and public and friends of the tribe to gain state recognition. I was instrumental in recruiting more than 60 new tribal citizens. I served on council for 8 years, and I now serve on council as a treasurer and as an elder for the Lenape Indian Tribe of Delaware. A more traditional introduction of who I am: my native name that was gifted to me is Three Winds. I was named after my grandmothers, who were Annas of the Wind. For 3 weeks after my birth, my name was Anna Mariah. I am the daughter of Elizabeth Cooper Lewis Tribbitt. My maternal grandmother is Anna Mariah Mosley Cooper. My maternal great-grandmother is Elizabeth Pritchett Mosley. My great-great-grandmother is Anna Mariah Clark Pritchett. Those are my foremothers. We are all women of the Turkey clan of the Lenape Indian Tribe of Delaware. Lenape is what we call ourselves. The European term for Lenape is the Delawares. To them, we were known as the people of Delaware. We are a matrilineal society. We introduce ourselves through our mother's lineage. This is the Lenape way. Matrilineal and matriarchal. This means that we are descended from our mother's clan, not our fathers. We are who our mothers are. It also meant that women were involved in the decision-making process for the greater good of the tribe. Women controlled the resources and economics. Our women were more than just mothers of the tribe's children. There were very few gender-based jobs. However, in many cases, it was the women who built the homes. They were warriors, farmers, hunters, and craftswomen. They maintained the home's roof and created new homes for tribal members to live in. They gathered firewood, cooked, and repaired clothing and shoes. They made tools for utensils and tools for hunting. There was a mutual respect that the men and women had for one another. The men knew that women were the source of life, and the women provided a feeling of strength, consistency, and community to their lives. Many believed that women had more healing power than men. They were important medicine women. Then there are our grandmothers. Grandmothers maintain their high status today as they did yesterday. Our grandmothers are the caregivers to our younger generation. Grandmothers are the family head. They are our leaders, dispensers of wisdom and spiritual guidance. Their stories are what has connected us throughout Indian country. Their stories have kept us alive. We are still here because of our grandmothers. At this time, let me introduce you to Nena Todd.
Thank you, Theo. And thank you everyone for being with us this afternoon. Again, my name is Nena Todd, and I am the Historic Site Supervisor for the Delaware Division of Historical and Cultural Affairs. I oversee the daily operations of the old State House Museum. I actually hail from Kansas. I was born there, as were 100 generations before me. I have 4 American Indian grandparents, and we were all collectively known as the Mound Builders. We farmed, we fished, we hunted, we loved, we laughed, we played, we cared for one another. We mourned for those who had crossed over, and we were stewards of the land and the living environment that we belonged to. We were all of those things. We were the human beings then, and we still are today. As Theo said, we often introduce ourselves by introducing who our grandmothers are. This is 4 generations. My mother, Dolores Boldridge Todd, is holding me. Her mother, Grace Beatles Boldridge, is next to her in the middle. And my great-grandmother, Lillian Beatles Ferguson, is on the end. I am the living embodiment of them. There was something else that Theo said that rings true, and that is that many occupations, most actually, were shared by both men and women. This is a picture of my grandmother and my grandfather, and they were both hunters, and they often hunted together or at times with other community members. I began my career in cultural resource management over 33 years ago when I was called to work at the Island Field Site, which was a Native American cemetery located in Kent County, Delaware. The Island Field Site changed the way anthropologists interpreted Native American history here in North America. The site contained the remains of over 260 men, women, and children. Excuse me. In the 1960s, when this site was first uncovered by archaeologists, their summation of the people buried at that site was that it was a group of really tall, warring men whose occupations were making arrowheads and hunting. Their diet consisted primarily of meat, and they were all led by a great and powerful chief, and they died out at a very early age. This assumption was written as fact in many archaeological journals. In 1984, Congress passed the NAGPRA law, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. This law stated that archaeologists working on Native American sites must consult with the interested tribes, and human remains and funerary objects had to be returned to those tribal entities. After NAGPRA passed that law, the state of Delaware passed its own law that said you can no longer have human remains on public display. So the state was forced to rebury all of the people in that cemetery. But before they did, they took that opportunity to do the osteology and the forensic analysis. The first bit of information that came in were the osteology reports. And they put the average height of the people at 5 feet 2 inches tall. So there went the tall man theory. The next bit of information that came back was that their diet consisted primarily of vegetation. They ate a small amount of meat and fish, but over 80% of their diet was nuts and berries. So there went the theory, that's all they did was hunt and eat meat. The next bit of information that came back was the average age. The average age of the person buried in that cemetery was 55 years. The oldest people buried in that cemetery were in their late 70s. 55 was just the average. So there went the theory that they all died out at an early age. I always like to ask people to guess what the #1 cause of death was amongst the people buried in that cemetery. And there were many theories as to how they died. So I'm going to ask all of you to answer this brief question, but before you do, know this: they almost all died from the same cause, but they did not all die at the same time. That cemetery was in use for a period of nearly 300 years, starting in 100 BC. And there are no bad answers because there were dozens of theories as to their cause of death. So please submit your answers in the chat. Are we taking them in the chat? Please submit your answers in the chat. As I said, remember, there are no bad answers. Is the chat disabled? I'm sorry, the chat is disabled. Can you put your answers in the question and answers? There we go. Get some. Well, as I said, some people got it. After the forensic analysis came back in, the cause of death was really quite shocking. If you said cavities, then you were right. Most of them died from cavities or dental caries. Look at the teeth. You can see the gum line at the top where the white part is, which indicates that the teeth were worn completely down. Many people don't realize that cavities can kill you. Your mouth has a direct blood flow to your heart. And if that infection gets into your bloodstream and goes to your heart, as I always say, you can pretty much cancel Christmas because you're probably not going to make it. In fact, many heart diseases that people suffer from today are directly related to the health of your teeth. So a good lesson for people from this cemetery is take care of your teeth. The reason why their teeth were in such bad repair was because they used a stone mortar and pestle to grind and process their food. That added a little bit of grit to their diet every day. And over the course of 55, 65, 75 years, it just literally sanded their teeth down. However, outside of the cavities, the people were actually in very good health. There was no sign of any trauma or injuries nor other illnesses. There was a small amount of arthritis in just a few people, but that was about it. The cause of death for the people in that cemetery wasn't the most shocking find in that cemetery. There were 11 chiefs that were buried in that cemetery. Those 11 chiefs were taller than the rest of the population. They averaged about 5'6" to 5'9" tall. They were buried with all sorts of elaborate ornaments and materials and funerary objects, many of which were made from non-local materials that came from all over North America. They were buried in different burial style than the others. They were laid flat on their back. They had their arms crossed across their chest. The funny thing about those 11 chiefs was they were all women. Those women were buried, as I said, with materials from all far-reaching corners of North America. There was copper and stone from the Midwest, West Coast, and even the Southwest. So archaeologists here had to ask the question, how did all of those non-local materials end up in burials in Delaware? You see, Delaware has very little workable stone. Outside of a small quarry in northern Delaware that's called Iron Hill, there is almost no stone that could be flint knapped into tools. Below the canal, there is no natural stone except for the glacial washdown, just pebbles and cobbles. In fact, if you were to drill to the center of the earth, you're not going to hit rock bed in Kent or Sussex County. So in Delaware, archaeologists always have to do the geomorphology, which pinpoints the exact location that stones originate from, because we don't have any here. This prompted other archaeologists, literally all over the country, to go back and look at the materials from their previous digs. And when they did the geomorphology, they found that almost every single Native American site had some degree of non-local materials in it. Materials as far away as the opposite coast, Canada, Mexico, even Central America. So they all had to ask the question, how did all of those non-local materials get there? The answer, of course, is trade. Since the 1970s, as more and more land development took place all over North America, more and more land had to be surveyed for material culture. The evidence became clear that there was not so much as a single square foot of North American soil that was not previously occupied. This explains how such an extensive trade network throughout the continent could take place. There was a large population of people. With this type of trade activity, they estimate the population of North America to be between 400 and 500 million people at the time of European contact. And I will turn it back over to Theo.
Thanks, Nina. In the 1840s, we had a lot going on in Indian country. So many of our families here in Delaware were being pushed out. With them, our people carried both names, the Lenape and the Delawares. Some of our people went to New Jersey, to Pennsylvania, to New York, to Canada. Some went to Indiana. Today, the ones that went to Indiana are the Delawares of Indiana. Some went to Michigan. Today, they are recognized as the Delawares of Michigan. Some went to Kansas. They are known today as the Delawares of Kansas. Some went to Idaho, and some went to Oklahoma, all carrying the name, the Delawares and or Lenape. So many of our families moved far, but some of us stayed here. We are the people that were left behind. We were left behind and were left unnoticed. We were able to assimilate in this great Kent County community. And what we say is that we were able to hide in plain sight. Many of our people were reclassified as free people of color. Another more recent historic Delaware Indian community is Fort Branch, located between Cheswold and Dover on Denny's Road behind the Delaware Technical Community College. Again, while studying the area to build new roads, DelDOT documented the Fort Branch community as a Native American dwelling. Archaeological researchers Dr. Ned Height and Dr. Kara Bloom headed the Bloomsbury Report in the 1980s. They found irrefutable proof that the native population had occupied that site into the modern era. Fort Branch is where some of our people lived. Their homes and farms were there. Their school and church was there, and their cemetery is there still. Our grandparents were born and raised and now buried there. When writing and preparing this speech, I was spending a lot of time on the historical, traditional, and educational terms to relay to you. But then I said to myself, this would be so much easier if I were to speak on a personal level. So this brings me to the very personal section of my talk today. My grandmother was born in Fort Branch, where DelDOT did their study. She went to the old school that was there. She attended the old church that was there. And she is buried in that cemetery there. My grandmother's upbringing did not allow her the privilege of being proud of her heritage. She was not able to say outside of the home, the family home, who she really was. She was taught to keep her mouth shut. Don't talk Indian talk. You see, my grandmother was born in 1894, right after the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre. Now, even though that massacre took place in the Midwest, there was something called the ripple effect. You can't believe you can believe that the information that was spread out like wildfire in Indian country. My grandmother's parents and many others in Cheswold were fearful of their lives. They had heard of the bloodshed where they killed the grandmothers and children and wiped out entire families. They were all told to keep their mouths shut. They did. They kept their mouths shut. Such tight-lipped is still being reflected today. We have so many Indians that will not say who they are for real because our foremothers told them to keep their mouths shut. Our elder women work just as hard today, and our women are still playing a significant role in tribal politics and community building. Women chiefs are not new to us. We also have many medicine women and spiritual leaders. Their works have been passed down through generations of daughters and granddaughters. Some of these descendants have roles today in national, state, and local tribal government. Today, in our own state of Delaware, we have a woman chief. She is Chief Natasha Carmine of the Nanticoke tribe. Chief Carmine is the first female chief in over hundreds of years to over 800 years to serve in the capacity of Delaware. Also close by is Chief Ann Richardson of the Rappahannock tribe in Virginia, and Chief Lynette Lewis Austin of the Nottoway Indian tribe of Virginia. And then there's Deb Howland, is the first Native American to lead a cabinet agency. She is the Secretary of Interior, and we are very proud of her. Nena?
Thank you, Theo. There is a lot of misinformation about Native people, their history, culture, and life ways. They are often interpreted from a European perspective. A perfect example of this is land and natural resources. Land represents something very different to American Indian people. In popular American culture, land is something that you can possess. You can conquer it, you can purchase it, you can trade it, you can mine it, you can farm it, you can develop it, you can exploit it. Land is money. That is why it is called real estate. But in Native American culture, land is not a commodity. It is an intricate living part of the culture. Land is not something that you buy or conquer. It cannot belong to us. We belong to it. Land is that which bears life, that which nurtures life, that which protects life, and sometimes that which disciplines life, very much like the female persuasion of all species. So because life itself and land itself have such feminine characteristics, women are the ones who reserve the right to maintain it. Land and women are synonymous. They are two parts of the same entity. Land is our mother. And in most Native American languages, the same word for land is the same word for mother. So because women reserve the right to maintain land, this changes not only how we utilize the land or how we navigate through it, but most importantly, it changes how our families and communities are formed. In popular American culture, when families are formed, traditionally, the woman goes with the man. After they take their vows, what's the first thing the woman does? Usually, she takes his surname, and she becomes forever known as part of the man's clan. Man's clan recognizes her as part of the man's clan. Society at large recognizes her as part of the man's clan. But in Native American culture, it is often a different situation. When men and women come together to marry, traditionally, the man goes with the woman. Why does he go with her? Because she has the land. Because she is the land. Any children they have are known as part of the woman's clan. Any girls they have will stay and inherit and maintain land, and the boys will grow up and leave and go to the communities that they marry into. So the women are always the constant factor, the unchanging part of the community. That is why women are recognized as leaders or even chiefs. Even though Native communities are matrilineal and matriarchal, that aspect of the culture is seldom recognized or respected in the popular American culture. Many find it hard to understand how a community could be led by elder women. I always like to ask people to think of it this way. If you and your whole extended family had a big family reunion down at Disneyland, and the CEO of Disneyland said to you, hey, you got a really good looking family. And so we're going to give you and your whole family a free week's vacation at Disneyland. But here's the thing. We're going to give you all of the tickets and the vouchers for everything all in one lump sum. And you have to choose one member of your family to be the executor and hand out the tickets. And it has to be someone who's going to make sure everybody has a place to stay and everybody gets something to eat. But you have a bit of a selfish request because you want to ride that Space Mountain ride 10 times because that is your ultimate favorite ride. But you're only given two choices that you could pick. It would be A, your grandmother, or B, your sister's husband. For most Native people, it would be the grandmothers without question. Why? That answer is simple. Everybody knows why. Because you know your grandmother loves you unconditionally. So if your grandmother said to you, baby, I'm not going to give you any tickets to ride on that Space Mountain ride because you're prone to motion sickness. Yeah, you'd be disappointed, but you know she's going to let you do a dozen other things that you really want to do so you can shake it off and still have a honking good time at the family reunion. But if your sister's husband didn't give you any tickets to ride on that Space Mountain ride, but him and your sister and their kids were riding on it, well, that'd be a little bit harder to dismiss. Your lips would be tight and you would wonder if his motives were purely selfish. So that might not be so easy to get over. That is why we choose to empower our grandmothers. They don't campaign for power or take it by force or a coup. We bestow that power on them because it keeps the peace and it prevents a lot of conflicts. From your birth, you know that your grandmother loves you unconditionally and has your best interest at heart. We have a saying among my people about grandmother's love. And we say that if you were being careless and you caught your house on fire and you burnt it to the ground, your family members would be so mad at you, they would turn their back on you and they'd call you careless and reckless, and they'd probably tell you that you need to go. But your grandmother would say, yes, that baby caught the house on fire, but it was a pretty fire. It was the most beautiful fire I've ever seen. Like I said, your grandmother loves you unconditionally. There are many myths about Native American people in the world today. And here are just a few to consider. One of the most prevalent myths about Native Americans is that they were always at war with each other before the Europeans came to this home. One reason for this theory is the classification of hunting tools as weapons. Now, we all know that practically anything can be weaponized, but that does not mean that they were utilized that way, especially if there is no trace evidence. There is no archaeological evidence prior to European contact of a war occurring in North America. There is not one shred of evidence to support that theory. Perhaps the reason that theory even developed in the first place is because upon Europeans' arrival to our home, They were engaged in war on many fronts and brought many of those skirmishes with them when they arrived. In most populations of people, for a war to start, you have to have one group that does not have enough of something. In North America, there was an abundance of sustainable resources. Even today, with all of the resources that have been squandered, we still have enough resources to sustain the world. Wars are less likely among groups that are egalitarian, matrilineal, and matriarchal, and those with abundance of landed resources. Although we may not be able to say conclusively how well they got along, we do know that they were getting along at least well enough to trade all the way across the continent. Another popular myth is about how they viewed themselves in the world, the us versus them mentality. Most communities were egalitarian and they were governed by a grandmother government, if you will. They did not see themselves as autonomous groups of people. They viewed themselves as part of the living environment, an environment that they were related to. They saw themselves as being related to rocks and trees and eagles and wolves and buffaloes. And if they were related to those things, then how could they not be related to each other? These ideas were introduced by Europeans who came with papal doctrines and different ideologies that stated that people who are not of the same skin tone, the same origin, the same religion, are to be considered the enemy of Christ and shall be conquered and laid to waste, and their possessions and lands taken for profit, and their people reduced to perpetual slavery. This ideology is known as the doctrine of discovery. Another popular myth is that they were savages and killers. George Washington considered Native Americans to be savages. Wild wolves is what he called them, vermin, that needed to be destroyed at every turn. He thought them to be violent and wild, and that perception still stands today. He set out to sack and desecrate entire villages with no remorse. I think it's important to note, too, that both Mount Vernon and Monticello are built upon Indian mounds. Indian burial or ceremonial mounds are common throughout North, Central, and South America. Mounds in North America are considered sacred places of worship, trade, reflection. And many of them were destroyed by the Europeans, but there are still some that remain, a few. I am actually a descendant of the mound builders. George Washington was known to Native people as the destroyer of communities. They could not understand, what do you gain when you destroy a whole community? The concept was unfathomable to Native Americans. They did not have a word for that type of action, so they used his name to voice such reprehensible actions. The term Washingtonay is still used today among some Native people. The wanton taking of life was considered sacrilegious. The European concept of you cannot occupy land with another living thing unless you can domesticate it, control it, exploit it, or you have to kill it, was not part of the Native American consciousness. They believe that the taking of life of any living thing was very, very serious. They believe that you don't kill anything unless you absolutely need to, only to protect yourself from harm or to feed yourself or for shelter or just if there was an absolute need. A good example of that is, bears. You know, why would you kill all of the bears? Instead of just the one that's trying to kill you or the one that you're trying to kill to eat. And yet another common myth is only men hunted and hunting was a sport. Hunting was not divided by sex. The first time I ever heard that was when I began working at the Island Field site. When I first heard it, I thought, if only the men hunted, wouldn't the women starve? I had never even heard such a thing. Is there another predatory animal on the face of the earth in which only one of the sexes hunts? It just didn't make any sense to me. And what if they had male offspring? How would they teach them to hunt? Not being able to hunt means that women would not be self-sufficient. You have to look at who is controlling the resources. In most egalitarian societies, the men and women are about the same size because they have equal access to the resources. The concept of domestication is again a foreign concept. Domestication is defined as someone who is controlling your environment, your food supply, and your reproduction. It's hard to domesticate a woman who has known freedom and self-sustainability. Hunting was a community affair. Most of the people in the community would be involved with hunting. We have a tendency to think that hunting was done as if it were a sporting contest with a few men tracking down an animal and then sneaking up and shooting it. But here's the problem. If you're hunting deer and you come up on a herd of deer and you shoot one and bring it down, what do the rest of them do? Of course, they would take off running. So, that works okay if you're just feeding a few people. But if you have 100 people to feed, you need to reduce the margin of error. So they developed a method called driving the animals. That is where you have someone, both men and women, with hunting tools, and you send them to a strategic area to hide. Everyone else forms a human chain and scares all of the animals into an ambush clearing. You never take the first one, you never take the second one, you never take the third one. But if you would need to take 6 or 7, then you would have that ability to do so. The whole community, down to the children, would be used to drive the animals. And I ask you, what makes more noise than a screaming baby strapped on your back when you're hooping and hollering, running through the woods? By driving animals, you would have a variety of creatures, and you could take less so that you would not hurt the population of any one species. Hunting was not a sport, it was a necessity. Another myth: tribes are governed by one male chief. The single male chief was a foreign concept. Most communities were governed by a council. That council was almost always elders, and those elders were almost always women. Single male chief concept was introduced to us by the Europeans when they didn't like the Council of Women and didn't want to talk to them. This included William Penn, who wrote about how troublesome it was talking to the women. There were many other Europeans also who wrote about it, and they didn't want to talk to the women about land or land usage. With Manifest Destiny, one of the first restrictions was women can't own land. They did this to justify removing the Native communities from the land. Theo, I'll turn it over to you.
The Lenape Nation has several goals. One is to educate the Delaware communities about the Lenape history and our ongoing cultural influence in Delaware. Our plan is to educate by raising the level of awareness to the people of Delaware as we preserve the history and culture of the Lenape Indian people. We have to make our Delaware communities aware of our existence. We have been invisible for so long. We have to do something different. So we have to now be more visible. We have to be visible to make it real. We're here today to make it real. We also have activities throughout the community that we invite you to attend. We do this because it is important to the preservation of the Lenape Indians. But more importantly, it is our tradition to know, build, and strengthen partnerships so that we may all flourish. It was that way with our ancestors, and it shall be that way with us. Former Governor Markell's mandate in 2015 was that the state of Delaware's educational system is to tell the whole history of Delaware. In fact, he said, teach the entire history, which includes the beginning, which includes the story of the first people of the first state. Our goal is to teach all of Delaware children that Native Americans have a Delaware history. We want to teach Native children that they have a thriving culture that has a long and vibrant history in Delaware. And we want to teach the Native children that they can embrace and celebrate their heritage with pride and dignity. We want to teach children, our Native children, to be leaders and strong members in their communities. Our ancestors struggled and strived and survived. There was a time when our people could not say aloud who they really were. But today I stand for my grandmother, my mama. I speak loudly for my mama, and I still miss her because she was big medicine. Oh,